Hello, and welcome to the Scope of Things podcast, a no-nonsense look at the promise and problems of clinical research based on a sweep of the latest news and emerging trends in the field and what I think is worthy of your 30 or so minutes of time. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News, which means I spend a lot of time with my ear to the ground on your behalf and a lot of hours every week speaking to top experts from around the world. Please consider making this your trusted go-to channel for staying current on things that matter, whether they give us hope or cause for pause. In another 8 minutes or so, I'll be speaking to Orr Inbar, CEO and co-founder of clinical trial design startup QuantHealth, about what's ahead when it comes to AI. But first, the latest news, including concerns surrounding the study and treatment of obesity, a new Opening Doors to Clinical Trials initiative, debate over the EU AI Act, the first international-level clinical study using secure multi-party computation, a hopeful treatment for kids with lethal brain tumors, and a trial GPT tool created by the National Institutes of Health. Widespread misinformation about what obesity is and how it should be treated is finally getting the attention it deserves, according to one of the most vocal advocates championing change across much of Europe. The inconvenient truth is that obesity is a series of linked diseases, and the underlying culprit is malfunctioning adipose tissue. But regulators have adopted body mass index, or BMI, as a surrogate marker of obesity, creating a ripple effect on evidence-producing clinical trials. This has exacerbated misunderstanding of GLP-1 drugs like Wegovy and Ozempic that has created both a shortage of the drugs for people who need them and a high drop-off rate from the medicines due to side effects, which are largely manageable, provided the drug is properly compounded and delivered at the right dose. A sea change is now underway regarding the criteria for marketing approval of obesity medications, and thus the information that gets collected in trials, as well as the post-marketing studies needed to comprehensively assess long-term outcomes. Look for an article on the many problems surrounding the study and treatment of obesity and the initiatives designed to address them in Clinical Research News. The nonprofit PAN Foundation, which since 2004 has been providing financial assistance to patients with life-threatening chronic and rare diseases, has just launched an Opening Doors to Clinical Trials initiative to educate people about clinical trials and provide a user-friendly trial finder tool and live person they can talk to who can answer their questions and direct them to needed resources. The intent is to advance the idea of clinical trials as a treatment option in a disease-agnostic fashion, especially for historically underrepresented groups from marginalized communities. The move comes on the heels of ramped-up interest among federal agencies and Congress to ensure diversity in clinical trials, as well as a recent survey finding a huge gap between people wanting and getting a conversation with their healthcare provider about trial participation opportunities. Early indications are that the initiative is poised for rapid expansion, and you can read all about why in a story that will be published in Clinical Research News. The impact of the European Union's AI Act on the already heavily regulated clinical research space has been sparking considerable debate, most recently at the Scope Europe conference in Barcelona. Notably, industry leaders expressed concern about the legislation's stifling effect on innovation and the formation of new companies, which might now pivot toward regions with more favorable regulatory environments, such as the U.S. and China. Small to medium enterprises, biotechs, and smaller pharma companies were advised to keep an eye on how enforcement authorities interpret the AI Act and any new guidances that get issued for some sense of direction. The legal framework could well influence the direction of regulatory oversight measures adopted elsewhere, including the U.S., where most smaller companies generally start their businesses anyway. The quality of the regulation is up for discussion industry-wide, as is whether the European member states charged with implementing measures in the AI Act have the bandwidth to do it effectively. Most AI could be considered high risk and thus subject developers and deployers to the most obligations because all of it, in one way or another, influences the lives of patients. I'll provide a link to a pair of stories on the topic that were published recently in Clinical Research News. International-level clinical study using secure multi-party computation has been reported in Europe. The technology enables institutions to cooperate without sharing personalized health data. Scientists from Germany and Italy, together with cryptography experts at Estonia-based Cybernetica, use the technique to demonstrate the efficacy and safety of MR-guided radiotherapy in the treatment of adrenal gland tumors. The so-called Federated Secure Computing Project, led by LMU Munich, was 5 years in the making. The architecture, developed by cloud computing startup Bytes for Life, is now freely available to researchers elsewhere without a dedicated cryptography team, and the calculations can be made in less than 20 minutes. Discussions are underway about a transatlantic use case and application of multi-party computation to the sharing of e-health surveillance data from patients being monitored at home. I'll link to the study in the show notes. You can also get all the plain language details in the story appearing in BioIT World. Hope has sprung anew for children suffering from a group of universally lethal brain tumors based on the results of a recent clinical trial investigating treatment with engineered CAR T cells developed at Stanford Medicine, where 9 of 11 study participants benefited and 1 had all detectable traces of the cancer erased and is healthy 4 years after diagnosis. The 9 responders subsequently had the therapy infused into the cerebral spinal fluid in their brains to lessen the side effects from when it was administered intravenously. The therapy is designated as a regenerative medicine advanced therapy by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, meaning researchers can take a fast track through the regulatory approval process. CAR T cells have been approved by the FDA since 2017 to treat blood cancers, but have not yet proven successful against solid tumors. The trial of the new CAR T therapy is ongoing and is the first ever human trial of its type for patients with diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, or DIPG. In the show notes, you can find a link to both the study in Nature and the press release covering the personal journey of the patient having the complete response. And finally, researchers from the National Institutes of Health have created an AI algorithm to match potential volunteers to relevant studies listed on clinicaltrials.gov. In a recent study, the Trial GPT tool performed nearly as well as human clinicians at identifying relevant clinical trials for patients and, importantly, provided a summary explaining how they met the criteria for study enrollment. The final output is an annotated list of clinical trials ranked by relevance and eligibility that clinicians can use to discuss clinical trial opportunities with their patients. In a pilot user study, clinicians using Trial GPT spent 40% less time screening patients while maintaining the same level of accuracy as manual reviewers. The model's performance and fairness are now to be further assessed in real-world clinical settings. You'll find a link to the study in the show notes. It is now time to bring in QuantHealth's Orr Inbar to talk about AI's potential for improving trial design and shaving millions of dollars off the global study budgets of sponsor companies. Who doesn't want to hear about this? Welcome to the show, Orr.
Hi, Deborah. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you coming to us all the way from Israel. Before we dive in, let's make sure everyone is up to speed on what is meant by clinical trial simulation, the work you do to add efficiency and cost savings to the notoriously complicated and expensive drug development process. So I have a 3-part question for you. In plain language, please explain A, what exactly are simulated clinical trials? B, in what phases of drug development are they used? And C, how specifically do they save sponsors time and money?
Yeah, so it's quite simple, actually. If you think about it, most complicated things that humans build today undergo extensive simulation, right? Whether it's spaceships or microchips. Anytime you develop a new model, you really have to test it every which way before you really build it and put it into the real world. For drugs, which are arguably even more complex than those other two that I mentioned, that's not the case, right? We've been doing things the same way for almost 100 years, which is just the second we have an active molecule that we have some sense that it might do something in humans, we give it to humans. And we're getting sort of incrementally better at applying data and applying, various analytical techniques to get a better sense, but we haven't really moved the needle much. And so the reality today is that over 90% of drugs that make it to the first clinical phases, they fail to make it all the way through to approval.
Mm-hmm.
At a staggering, 95% even in oncology. And so it's quite a shame. And so really with the amount of data that we have sort of out there and that's been, frankly, exponentially proliferating over the last, decade or so, right? I think today healthcare is the number one industry in terms of, net new data created. And yet we don't really do enough to utilize that data to help solve this mega problem around really getting these drugs through R&D successfully. And so that's really where we come in is we essentially help predict how a drug will work in the human body. And we're especially good at doing this for novel drugs and making these predictions in a real world scenario. So we actually simulate patients by using point of care data. So really looking at an actual patient with say with type 2 diabetes or obesity or any of those other highly complex diseases that you mentioned earlier, and really looking at their full patient history, and then by building out these models that can essentially capture the full clinical effect of a drug, give that drug virtually to the patient, for whom, again, we have large amounts of data we know a lot about, and then predict what that patient's outcome will be in terms of the same exact outcomes or endpoints that would be tested in a clinical trial. So it's sort of the first time in history that a pharma company can really take a novel drug that is, about to hit phase one, which is, the first time it's, being put in humans, and actually have a pretty good sense about how that drug will perform in terms of efficacy and safety across a broad number of patients across the globe. And that's a real game changer because, again, until now, they have to do things the old-fashioned way. And so our mission is really to bring this amazing technology to the world and help, on one hand, reduce the time and effort that it takes to get these drugs through the pipeline, but more importantly, get as many of these drugs, effectively delivered to patients. Many of whom can't wait for novel therapies to come through. It's really a humbling experience, I think, to be in this time and age where we can do these kinds of things. It's really exciting.
Yeah. Now, I had read that QuantHealth has completed more than like 100 of these simulated clinical trials, I guess, to date that have shown to do a pretty good job of modeling how a drug will affect the human body. And I guess these are the phase one studies. I'm not sure if it's all phase one or not, but maybe you can clarify that. But also, it was an 85% predictive accuracy rate that was reported. And the second question, I guess, is that good enough? And what's going on with the other 15%?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So yeah, we've done about 100. It's actually more. The number keeps climbing as we continue our work. It's mostly, I'd say, phase two actually, and then quite a few phase threes, and then a number of phase ones as well. So I'd say really our focus has been phase two. That's where the industry has sort of really needed us most, because phase two is, phase one is primarily about safety, right? Usually safety is a little bit easier to predict, and also there's some amount of tolerance for drugs being not perfectly safe as long as they're safe enough but are efficacious, right? It also has to do with the need, right? But anyway, it tends to be a little bit easier. And phase two is really the first time where drugs are tested for efficacy. Efficacy is the hard part, right? That's really where you kind of hope that the drug has the biological effect that you hope it will have on the disease that you're trying to treat. And so it's a much more specific ask, kind of biologically speaking, and therefore much harder to model. And we see this in the failure rates too. I mean, phase two trials fail at about 75% on average, with the highest of all three phases.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so that's really where we've been the most active. But there's plenty of need, really across all three phases, and the technology is easily applied across those three phases.
The 85% predictive accuracy, the fact that it's in phase two is telling. Is that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And to your question about what that means, it basically there's a number of ways to look at accuracy, but this is sort of the simplest perhaps. And it simply says, how often do we correctly predict the result of the primary endpoint on a success or failure basis, right?
Mhm.
So when you test a drug, you're looking to see how effective is the drug, and how much more effective is it than what you're comparing it against. And so it's not a binary answer, per se that you're actually measuring, but oftentimes, when a drug is approved, that's a binary decision, right? It's either approved or or it fails.
Mm.
So that's what we're predicting, is whether the primary endpoint will essentially be approved by the regulator or not.
Are you enjoying the conversation? We'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the podcast and give us a rating. It helps other people find and join the conversation. If you've got speaker or topic ideas, we'd love to hear those too. You can send them in a podcast review.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's not dive in a little into the proprietary AI technology that's powering all of this. I'm curious what sort of data has been trained on, how it will be kept up to date over time, how users know they can trust its output. So dive in here if you would, please.
So if you look at how most clinical simulations have been done to date, and it's hasn't been done really effectively or at scale, but the cases where it has been attempted has largely been in the preclinical to clinical transition. And we see sort of quantitative systems pharmacology teams taking their preclinical models, which basically is dose optimization studies in animals, and then trying to basically use those models for humans. And you're trying to match between humans and animals, and you're trying to leap from, again, safety models to efficacy models, which are very, very different. And frankly, the reason it doesn't work is because those approaches are using a limited data set, again, that only talks about drug biology from the preclinical setting. And that's only half the picture. Now, on the other hand, you have quite a number of companies and and drug manufacturers leveraging clinical data, real world data, from EMR systems and medical insurance systems to model kind of patient outcomes and epidemiology, right? Kind of really looking at the patient side of things. But in order to predict how novel drugs will work in humans, you need both of those data sets combined into a single AI architecture. And that's what nobody has really been able to do, which QuantHealth has, researched for many years and finally succeeded in doing, which has been proven, to your point, on over 100 clinical trials with over 85% accuracy. So essentially what we've been able to do is take all this early stage data that describes and maps out everything we know about drugs and their biological effects on the biological systems of humans and cells, all the way down to the protein level. This really helps us capture again the biological effects of the drug. And then by combining that with this clinical data set of patients, again, where we have, on average 10,000 data points per patient, over about 10 to 15 years for over 300 million patients, we can then take those drug representations derived from the early stage data and then essentially project that onto this clinical data set to actually make these assertions about how the drug will work in terms of real world outcomes. So we can take, for instance, a third generation GLP-1 or even a fourth generation GLP-1 that hasn't been approved yet, or even take a totally new target, a totally novel class of drug, put that into our system, and then predict how, let's say, a lung cancer patient will respond to that drug and see if it'll affect their progression-free survival of the disease, have an effect on their mortality, on their prognosis. in a very controlled and accurate fashion.
Mhm. To what degree are you seeing study sponsors utilize synthetic trials where they're creating a control group to match a real treatment group? And given that there are at least some other competitors out there, in some sense, doing this sort of work, under what circumstances does QuantHealth tend to be the chosen partner?
Yeah, it's a good question. So let's peel that back a bit.
Okay.
So synthetic data to date has typically been used in what is known as external control arms,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is where basically, instead of enrolling patients and putting them on a drug that we already know how it works, right? The control or the comparator, which is typically half the trial, and that's unethical and inefficient. Researchers, came together with the FDA and said, hey, why can't we just use data, historical data that already demonstrates how those drugs work in patients like the ones we're enrolling in our trial? Can we just use that instead, right? And so we now have a number of examples, right, where sponsors have been able to only enroll patients on the experimental drug or on the experimental arm, and for the rest of the trial use data or synthetic, essentially a synthetic trial. But again, this is only confined to the control arm. So I think there's still a lot of room for this to grow and become more widely accepted, and it's a shame that it's taking longer than it is. But nonetheless, it's a fairly proven out use case. The bigger question is, well, what about the investigational drug? Can we simulate that too? Because that's of course what we're actually testing and what we're actually interested in really finding out about, how that drug works. And so the FDA isn't going to be as, or the EMA for that matter, isn't going to be that, excited to adopt, synthetic data for the experimental arm, because again, the science there is much more complex and probably still needs to be tested on humans. So today, for the most part, our technology is helping these pharma companies do better planning and better design of their trials, so that when they actually do the trial, they're enrolling patients who are likely to benefit from the drug, and therefore are more likely to demonstrate positive results to the regulator, and thereby increasing their chances of getting their drug approved and on the market.
Is that an easy story to tell study sponsors? Do they get it?
Surprisingly, it is, because to them this notion of failed clinical trials is it hits them down to their core, right? I mean, every day you hear about massive failures, these big phase 3 trials that have been drugs that have been researched for 5, 10 years, and then finally, these companies have invested billions into these drugs, and then you finally reach the last mile, and poof, the drug fails, right? And this happens like 9 times out of 10.
Yeah.
So they're so used to failing that they've never really paused to second guess, can we do things differently? So, but at the same time, right, it's something that they're constantly fearful of. And so when a technology that is presented to them, especially one that's proven, demonstrates that you can do better, you can do much, much better, then it is, earth-shattering, right? It's the value is immediately apparent, right? Again, if and only if it actually works, right? That's sort of the flip side, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I have this crystal ball. Great. If it works, like, of course I want to have it. So that's why most of our early work with any partner is just actually proving out that what we do is, in fact, real, because it's such a transformative technology. It's like if somebody told you, right, hey, I have this new thing called, ChatGPT, and I can talk to it like a real person, and it can tell me, it can answer any question that I would ever want to ask, like a real human being. You've never seen this before. You would say, no way.
Yeah.
Right. So it's the same thing here, right? And then we do this, and since we're accurate 85% of the time, which in pharma speak is, pristine, because again, we're talking about 90% failure rate. So going from 10% success to 85% success is massive.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, I'm going to pivot on you here because I know that QuantHealth is involved in some drug repurposing work. And I want to ask you about this because I recently interviewed a Harvard scientist who had used AI to predict drugs that could be repurposed for diseases without cures. And it was a graph foundation model known as TXGNN, trained across thousands of diseases. And some of its leads are to be followed up on by studies being sponsored by rare disease foundations. And this model, like the one I believe is used by QuantHealth, involves these so-called knowledge graphs. And I was hoping you could talk a bit about their power in the drug repurposing realm.
Yeah, certainly. So TXGNN, if I have to kind of break that apart, right? So TX means therapy, shorthand for therapy, GNN, shorthand for graph neural networks. So It's a therapeutic graph neural network, right? That's a type of AI system that's used to make these, kinds of predictions. So the knowledge graph is essentially that's that preclinical data set that I described earlier, right? It's that data set that describes kind of the drug human biology that underpins a lot of these drugs that we're researching. And and we use the knowledge graph too, and a lot of them are quite similar. They kind of look at information about different cell processes and different proteins and how genes and how all those things interact, and most importantly, how different drugs and therapeutic modalities affect those systems. It's become quite common. If you search PubMed, you'll see thousands of publications looking at knowledge graphs and GNNs to solve things like drug repurposing. And it works quite well. The main problem, or I'd say shortcoming, of these approaches using just GNNs to do things like drug repurposing is that, there's two problems. One is you're only looking at existing or known treatments, right? So when you say drug repurposing, by definition, that entails looking at a drug that has already been approved or maybe failed, but is a well-known drug, right? And so how do you then take that and apply that to a novel therapy that's not being repurposed, a totally de novo asset? That's much harder to do because you have less data, less information about that new drug. It's not in the knowledge graph. Mm-hmm. So we've developed a technique to actually be able to incorporate novel assets and essentially embed those into those knowledge graphs, and then be able to use those as if they're part of the known drug biology landscape.
A smarter knowledge graph.
Yeah, exactly. That can do more than just repurposing. They can actually do new purposing, right?
Gotcha.
Yeah. Now the other shortcoming of knowledge graph only approaches is that because they don't use clinical data, they only use again sort of biological data. They're not able to translate the predictions, or they're not able to create clinically relevant predictions. So you might be able to say, this new, GLP or this new statin, we'll score this with a 0.9 for cardiovascular disease, and, this other drug will score with a 0.72, right? It'll be ranked a little bit lower. When you then show that to a clinician or to the FDA, they have no idea what to make of that. It's basically a random number from 0 to 1. Now, to an AI researcher, that gives a lot of insight onto maybe like what drugs to prioritize for further research, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot about how that drug will actually work in the way that a clinician looks at things. And that's really important because when you're doing things like synthetic trials, you can't just give an arbitrary number. It needs to be in a real world clinical measure that clinicians are actually measuring and looking for and comparing. And it turns out that doing that is actually really, really hard. And you essentially have to combine that data with a clinical data set, again, like we're doing, using a patient level data set to be able to translate those kind of, biological scores into actual patient level clinical outcomes. And that's the hard part.
Yeah. And I want to actually stick with the AI topic from my last question here, because advances in AI are just in general moving at lightning speed, but presumably at a somewhat less hectic speed in the highly regulated clinical trials arena. So I'm wondering, do you have any sort of parting thoughts on what new territory we might see AI moving into as 2025 unfolds, or if we'll be seeing a legal framework, the scope of the new EU AI Act start to emerge, in the US or anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. So on the regulation side, I actually think that, so Europe favors regulation much more than the US. And I think it's been one of the main reasons that sort of stifled innovation in the EU, frankly, over the last decade or so.
Mm-hmm.
And additionally, I think now with the Trump administration and recent appointments, I think we're likely to see even more deregulation in the US. And with people like Elon Musk at the, part of that team too, are also notoriously against regulation as well. I think we'll see more and more of that. And so I actually expect there to be very fertile ground for further adoption of AI into these more, call it historically more regulated spaces. But even, until now, we've seen, I'd say a refreshingly liberal approach on the FDA's propensity to actually begin to incorporate and look more carefully at these technologies with the understanding that they can actually benefit. The FDA is hammered with new drug applications, more and more so every year, and they can't keep up. And I think so that they're also looking for ways to, to ease the burden and to help advance the state of research. And I think AI is the answer for a lot of that. Now, granted, it has to happen, responsibly and carefully. And so the FDA has put out some frameworks around AI. And, we've actually even had some headway with the FDA ourselves, and we have a number of actually use cases that we're exploring with them on how we can apply our simulations. And they're open. They're open to talking about this, to thinking about it together and collaboratively. I do expect there to be call it a slow but concerted effort to really integrate AI into clinical workflows. Yeah, as far for what we'll see, I think in the coming year in terms of the applications, I think we'll keep seeing more and more on data sharing. That tends to be and data openness, which is sort of not really AI in and of itself, but it's a really important bedrock for AI.
Right.
Various frameworks for how to handle data. And then ultimately that will probably transcend into AI as well, right? How do we ensure, consistency and reliability of these AI models that then sit on top of this, more robust and reliable data infrastructure?
Well, it'll be interesting to see if it all pans out as you imagine. A lot of unknowns, but a lot of promising new developments that we haven't seen really stick for quite a while. A lot of talk, but some real teeth of these things these days. I appreciate that you care so deeply about producing data that is truly informative and not polluted with biases that can creep in. So at the end of the day, we have therapies that are not only faster and cheaper to develop, but benefit the patients they were designed for. Thanks for being a part of this complex enterprise and enlightening our readers about the value AI can bring to the table, and for being my guest on today's show.
Yeah, no, thank you. We're all on this journey to make better treatments for patients, and we'll only accomplish it together. So
you got it. Amen to that. As always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. If you're not subscribed to this podcast yet, please consider going to Apple Podcasts and doing so right now so you don't miss your monthly dose of news and perspectives you'll be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. And if you're up for it, I'd also be so very grateful if you'd leave a rating and review while you're there. One final note, if you like today's show, it's only a glimpse of news and insights we have on tap for the next Scope event taking place in sunny Orlando, Florida. Please plan to join me there February 3rd through the 6th, 2025, and be sure to use discount code SOT10 for a 10% discount off any current rate. For more information, visit scopesummit.com. Bye for now.